The room is dim, the air thick with dust and incense. Heavy velvet curtains blot out the sun. The clock ticks, slow, deliberate, as if time itself is afraid to move too quickly in her presence. There, hunched in a carved chair of blackened oak, sits the queen of the world, not in ermine, not in jewels, but in mourning black. Her fingers, swollen with age, tremble as they press pen to paper. She is writing again, not to ministers, not to allies, but to a man who has been dead for decades. She signs the letter, "Ever yours, devotedly, Victoria," then seals it, then places it in a box that no one is allowed to open. Outside these chambers, the empire roars. Commotives scream across continents. Telegraphs tick with news of wars and weddings. Colonies expand. Cities swell. But within her walls, silence. She has become a monument, a living shrine to grief. Her advisors beg her to appear. Her people call her the Widow of Windsor. And still she writes. She hears him in dreams, in mirrors, in the hush between midnight and dawn. This isn't the story of Victoria the Great, not the one sung in schoolbooks, not the one cast in marble. This is the story of a woman who drowned in her own devotion, a woman who became the symbol of an age, even as the age left her behind. She ruled for 63 years, held a quarter of the globe under her name, but she could not hold him. And when Albert died, something in her, something central, fractured. They said it was grief. But grief passes. Hers didn't. It metastasized, became ritual, became policy, became the quiet iron at the center of the British Empire. So many have asked, was it love that made her mourn so deeply? Or was it fear? Was Albert a husband? Or a mirror that showed her who she wasn't? Because after he died, she stopped being a woman. She became a shadow with a crown. She ordered the palace mirrors covered, wore black every day for 40 years, refused to smile in portraits, refused to walk gardens she once adored. She slept with his robe beside her, his shaving kit untouched on the dresser. She held seances. She begged spirits to come, a monarch who ruled the material world, desperate to touch the invisible. And yet, for all her absence, her presence grew. Statues rose, poems inked, flags waved while she wept in silence. The empire marched. One hand gripped mourning, the other a sword. Is that not horror? That the grief of one woman became policy for millions, that her refusal to move on was mistaken for strength. What is the true cost of a monarch's sorrow when the mourning lasts longer than love itself? Victoria did not die in fire. She was not guillotined. Her blood was not spilled on cobblestones. And yet, she was not spared horror. Hers was the long horror, the elegant horror, the type carved into years, not moments, the horror of erasure. Because before the black veil, before the empire, before the endless funerals and withered hands, there was a girl, a small girl, trapped in a palace, writing in secret, whispering to herself in the cold halls of Kensington, "I will be good." And the world believed her. But to understand what she became, to understand the letters, the mirrors, the silence, we must go back to the beginning, before the grief, before the veil, before Victoria became more myth than mother, more widow than woman, before her own words, the thousands of pages she left behind, were edited, burned, and rewritten by those who feared what they revealed. This is the true story, not of her reign, but of her erasure. She was born in a cage made of lace, not raised, but managed, moved like a pawn from room to room under the watch of cold-eyed advisors, and a mother who feared the world more than she loved it. She was not allowed to walk the stairs without holding someone's hand, not allowed to sleep without the bed being inspected. She was not taught to be a girl. She was taught to be a monarch. Even before the crown touched her head, it weighed on her. The Kensington system, they called it. A method of control disguised as motherhood. Every letter she wrote was read, every step observed. She had no friends, only handlers. And from this isolation, she learned one thing above all, that power is both armor and prison. By the time she turned 11, they whispered of destiny in the hallways, that she would be queen, that the bloodline narrowed to her, that history, the great, brutal river of it, had chosen her tiny, shaking hands. But history never chooses gently. When she ascended the throne at 18, the world saw a crown and a smile. But inside her, the terror of being alone, truly alone, bloomed like rot. She clutched her diaries like lifeboats. She wrote every day, thousands of pages, thoughts no one would read until she was dust. She could not trust her mother. She feared her uncles. She hated the courtiers who called her girl with bitter smiles. But the people, the public, adored her. They saw her as fresh, young, pure. They saw innocence. They saw hope, and she played the part. She walked up gardens with grace. She blessed ships. She met diplomats. But at night, she sat in the silence of Buckingham Palace and wondered, who am I if everyone else writes the script? The irony was sharp. The girl who was given everything was allowed nothing of herself. Then came Albert, and with him, for the first time she saw the outline of a life that could feel real. Someone who read her journals. Someone who challenged her. Someone who looked past the crown and saw the caged girl beneath it. She called him the angel of my life. She told him things she'd never said aloud. She let him shape her, let him guide her. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of the end. Because when love becomes doctrine, when affection becomes control, what begins in safety ends in silence. But not yet. For now, the world saw a queen ascending, dressed in white, riding through crowds who tossed roses and shouted her name. No one saw the child in the carriage. No one saw the strings tied to her wrists. No one asked, who is she when she is finally alone? They only saw the crown, and mistook it for strength. It began as devotion, then bloomed into dependence, and finally hardened into command. Albert did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply expected. Expectations, when laid in gold, are harder to escape than chains. Victoria called him her guide, her conscience, her better half. Slowly, with each decision handed to him, each letter he rewrote, each minister he redirected, the monarch became the wife, and the wife became small. She called it partnership. Others called it a quiet coup. Albert was brilliant, rational, a master of reform and restraint. But where Victoria ruled with fire, he ruled with frost. And slowly, the palace grew colder. The diaries once filled with color and confession became lists, observations, revisions of thought. The girl who once ached to be heard began censoring herself, even on paper. And the irony, she believed it was love. That giving herself to him entirely was proof of loyalty. That obedience was grace. That surrender was sacred. But who teaches a queen to kneel? Who tells her that being beloved means being erased? Albert never raised a hand. He didn't need to. Kawa, after all, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet dismissal. A gaze that says, I know better. Silence that demands apology. A rule enforced with a smile. He restructured her court, corrected her speeches, questioned her emotions. It's impulsive, he'd whisper, too sentimental. And so, piece by piece, she became less visible, less certain, less free. And when she did rebel in letters, in tears, in sudden flares of fury, he called it hysteria. The word men use when women remember they have voices. Her ministers noticed. The people speculated. But no one interfered. Because, from the outside, it looked perfect. A moral union, okay? God-fearing household, okay? Model monarchy. And maybe she believed that too. Maybe it's easier to cling to illusion when the truth is too cruel to name, that even queens can be made into shadows, that even in the highest tower, a woman can be caged, not with iron bars, but with love. Was this love or a fatal mistake? Because when Albert died, her sorrow was real, but so was the silence that followed. She didn't just lose a husband, she lost the man who had rewritten her, and now, for the first time in decades, she had to speak for herself again. But did she still remember how? He died quietly. A fever, they said. Typhoid. But to her, it felt like the world cracked open. December 1861, Windsor Castle. The king, who never wore a crown, laid still beneath velvet sheets. Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, collapsed. The silence began that day and never truly ended. She wore black for 40 years, refused public appearances, refused color, laughter, light. Her court was draped in mourning, not just for Albert, but for what she had been when he was alive. People called it devotion. Historians called it obsession, but maybe it was something darker, a grief so deep it became identity. And in that black veil, she found power. She became the widow empress, the ghost monarch. More statue than sovereign, but statues command reverence. Her absence became myth. Her silence became spectacle. Mourning became monarchy. The empire expanded India, Africa, the South Pacific, and yet the woman who ruled it withdrew further into shadow. Behind every telegram of conquest, every treaty signed in her name, there was a room with the windows shut. A woman staring at ink-stained diaries and speaking only to the dead. Courtiers whispered. Ministers begged her to return. But she ruled. From silence, grief became governance. No speeches, no debates, only edicts and portraits and rumors of a queen who had lost everything and somehow held everything. But power drawn from absence is fragile. It demands reverence, but resists scrutiny. And people began to question, was she still fit to rule? She a grieving widow, or a monarch who had forgotten how to feel anything else? 'Cause grief, when it calcifies, becomes something cruel. And the Victoria, who once galloped on horseback and scribbled love notes, became a sovereign encased in ritual, superstition, and self-made myth. She kept Albert's rooms untouched, laid out his clothes daily, consulted his memory before making decisions. It wasn't just mourning, it was preservation of him, of her past self, the world as it was before death entered the palace. But death had entered, and now it ruled with her, even her children, her ministers. The nation, they became subjects of a queen who no longer reigned through presence, but through absence, through shadow, through silence. Can a country survive being ruled by a ghost? Because grief may not kill the body, but it consumes the soul. And sometimes mourning becomes a mask worn so long that you forget who you were underneath it. She was shrinking. The queen, who once rode stallions through Windsor's grounds, now needed to be lifted from bed by servants trained to look away. Her bones thinned, her spine bent, and her corsets, once armor, now bruised her skin. But she refused to let them go. To Victoria, to loosen the corset was to surrender, to womanhood, to weakness, to death. She couldn't walk far, couldn't eat much. Her teeth were failing, her breath shallow. And yet, her table was still set for Albert. Her letters still addressed to him. Her meals often left untouched, not out of appetite, but as if eating would acknowledge that. The world had moved on. She had ruled over the greatest empire on earth, and yet she now required help to stand. And still, she dictated. Still, she signed documents. Still, she scrawled in her diary in that tight, meticulous hand. the ink like veins on a dying body, feeding her story back into itself. Her doctors grew concerned, but few dared speak the full truth. Her stomach began to bloat. The tight gowns no longer fit. Rumors spread, tumors, water retention, internal decay, but her entourage covered mirrors, adjusted lighting, kept cameras at a distance. Schweiss, not to be seen aging, not to be seen dying. Behind palace walls, her body betrayed her in silence. Her ankles swelled, her fingers stiffened. She grew forgetful. Some days, she called out for Albert and wept when he did not come. Other days, she signed papers about colonies she no longer understood. They say she once forgot the name of a foreign minister and cried for hours, not because she forgot, but because forgetting proved she was human, and she hated being human, even as her organs faltered. Her legend grew. Statues were raised in her name across continents. Coins bore her fading profile. She had become immortal in bronze, even as her own flesh began to rot. But no statue feels pain. No empire feels hunger. And no crown, no matter how heavy, can hold up a collapsing body. What does it mean to be the most powerful woman in the world when your spine bends like a willow and your breath comes in gasps? Victoria lived, but only in name, in myth, in ritual. The real woman was dying slowly, quietly, in layers, flesh, then memory, then self, and even in her final months. No one dared say it aloud, because when a monarch dies, a myth dies too, and myths don't go quietly. The curtains were drawn, not just to block the winter sun, but to preserve the illusion that here, in this gilded chamber, scented with lavender and laudanum, the queen was simply resting, that the weight of an empire did not hang in the stillness. Between heartbeats, she lay on a chaise carved from oak, older than the colonies. Her skin was parchment, her breath thin, measured, royal. The nurses moved like ghosts. They spoke in whispers, not out of fear of waking her, but of disrupting the choreography of her final hours. For even death in the house of Victoria required protocol. On her nightstand, a portrait of Albert, faded at the edges, her wedding ring worn thin with grief, and a letter she had written but never sent, addressed only to my beloved. The world grew too loud without you. She had ruled for 63 years, outlived lovers, children, ministers, and rivals. And now, the clocks in Osborne House ticked as if daring her to outlast time itself. But no monarch outlives death, no matter how many statues bear their name. The doctors called it a cerebral hemorrhage. The newspapers said peaceful, the servants said merciful. But in truth, her body failed in silence, like a grand cathedral whose pillars gave way, beneath stained glass in prayer. Her fingers curled inward, her mouth slackened, and her eyes, once sharp enough to command nations, now stared past the walls, past the bed, past the crown award. A man in black, waiting in memory. When the final breath came, it was not a gasp, it was a release, not of pain, but of empire. She died in black lace, with a lock of Albert's hair sewn into her gown, and her mother's wedding ring tucked in her palm. A queen veiled in mourning until her final moment. Outside, bells tolled across Britain. In India, cannon fire roared in salute. In Africa, her name was stitched into hymns. But inside the room, there was no anthem, no grand speech, only the rustle of silk, the crumbling of history. The end of a woman who had once believed the sun would never set on her rule. And perhaps, in that final flicker of consciousness, Queen Victoria realized the cruelest truth of all. Even monarchs die as women do. They came with gloves and orders, not tears. The room where she died was not allowed to stay still. Servants moved like shadows, cataloging, covering, cleansing. Her sheets were changed, before her body cooled, her letters sealed. Tina, the queen was dead, but the monarchy had already begun the act of forgetting her as a woman. Within hours, the empire's machinery turned. Mourning orders were issued. Flags dropped to half-mast. Court dress codes changed to black. Newspapers printed headlines in bold. The queen is dead. God save the king. Not even a breath between her end and another's beginning. They embalmed her, not with reverence, but with strategy. Her body was stiffened to look regal in death, her jaw tied shut beneath her veil. She was positioned, posed, preserved. Not for peace, but for posterity, for photographs, for proof that she had passed with dignity. But they lied. They did not say how small she had become, how her skin was paper, how her corsets no longer fit. They did not print the truth that she died not as the ruler of the world, but as a grieving widow who had never stopped writing letters to a ghost. Even her burial was a performance. Her coffin, lined with mementos, no one outside the royal circle was allowed to see. A dressing gown, a handkerchief, a plaster cast of Albert's hand, a photo of her last servant, John Brown, hidden beneath her pillow because her family disapproved of his memory. She was laid to rest in the Frogmore Mausoleum, alone, walled off from the public. Her tomb did not bear her full name for months, and the people who had once bowed before her forgot how to pronounce her middle names. Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, Defender of the Faith, but not mother, not lover. Woman, the state carved her into a statue before her body was even cold. And so the myth began, not of the girl who became queen, but of the queen who had never been a girl at all. She died in the early 20th century, but the 19th never left her. Victoria was buried, but her shadow stayed, not in palaces, but in policies, not in memory, but in myth. Her reign was so long, it rewrote time itself. Historians called it an era, an entire chapter of human civilization named after a single woman. But what legacy does an empire of silence leave? In the decades that followed her death, monarchs came and went. Wars erupted. Flags changed. But one thing remained unshaken: the idea that royalty must never show grief, weakness, desire, doubt. Victoria hadn't just ruled the British Empire. She'd ruled over its heart, and she locked it in mourning. Her face stayed on stamps, statues, coins, but not her words, not her rage, not her unbearable loneliness. They erased the letters to Albert. They downplayed her obsession with John Brown. They refused to speak of the Indian servant who sat at her feet and whispered to her in Urdu. They stripped her, the very things that made her human, and then turned her into an icon of British discipline. But discipline is a mask, okay? Masks crack. Today, we look back at the so-called Victorian values, repression, modesty, quiet suffering, and we call them outdated, but we still live in their architecture. In governments that fear vulnerability, care, in monarchs who smile but never speak freely, and daughters taught to endure in silence. Victoria's true legacy was not the expansion of empire. It was the burial of emotion in favor of order. She made it law to mourn, but never to scream. Even her descendants carry her ghost in the stiffness of royal ceremonies, in the denial of mental health, in the way certain names are never spoken aloud. The throne still sits heavy, not because it is gold, but because it carries the weight of a woman who was never allowed to weep. So ask yourself, was she the last great queen or the first truly imprisoned one? Because long after her empire crumbled, the ghost of Victoria still wears the crown. They were not meant for history. They were meant for him. Ink soaked with longing, pages crumpled by a widow's hands. Victoria wrote thousands of letters to Albert long after his death, not as a queen, but as a woman suspended in grief. These weren't proclamations. They were confessions, and they were dangerous because they revealed something the empire couldn't accept: that its most powerful monarch had lived most of her life obsessed, haunted, dependent, not on her crown, on a man buried beneath stone. Albert had not just been her husband. He had been her compass, her religion, her reason, and when he died, she unraveled. The public called it devotion. The palace called it madness, but the letters told another story, one of desperate need, of self-erasure, of emotional collapse disguised as loyalty. She wrote of his scent, of his voice in dreams, of wishing death would come just to join him sooner. She wore black every day for 40 years, but grief wasn't her only secret. Tucked among the letters were other names: John Brown, Abdul Karim, names that made the monarchy shiver. Servants, commoners, men she trusted, perhaps loved more than her own children. They gave her companionship, freedom, truth, and for that, they were erased. After her death, her family burned the letters. Not all, but enough to rewrite the woman into something else, something safe. The Prime Minister called it preserving dignity. But what he meant was bury the truth with her. And yet, some fragments survived, enough to piece together the reality that the woman we were taught to call Caria the Great was also Victoria the Wounded, that her secrets were not sins, but symptoms of a world that punished queens for having hearts. So the question remains, if a woman's truest self is written in ink, what does it mean when the ink is burned? And how many queens have been silenced, not by scandal, but by fire? She turned grief into policy, mourning into law. After Albert's death, Victoria didn't just retreat, she reshaped the monarchy around absence. Curtains were drawn for decades. Black became the royal color. Mirrors were covered. Even servants whispered less, as though sorrow had ears. This wasn't mourning, it was ritualized despair. The court adapted. Ministers learned to work through closed doors. Cues, portraits of Albert replaced political advisors. Entire state functions were canceled to accommodate her silence. And the longer it went on, the more it became a symbol of devotion. Yes, but also of denial. A monarchy built on mourning cannot move forward. It can only petrify. Funerals became theater. Queen Victoria attended them like a priestess of sorrow. Each death reinforced her own. She wore black 2 weddings. She refused sit for joyous portraits. She buried not just Albert, but the entire idea of royal celebration. And the people they followed. Black crept into fashion. Grief became a moral virtue. To cry too loudly was vulgar. To remarry quickly was scandal. To heal was suspicious. Victoria's sorrow became the template for an empire's emotional discipline. Even the architecture mourned. Mausoleums, death masks, memorial statues, more granite was poured for the dead than for the living. It was as if the empire itself was trying to prove its love through monuments instead of mercy. But here's the quiet horror. Grief became a form of control. Women were told to mourn like Victoria, to stay loyal to their husband's ghost, to sacrifice joy for respectability. Children were raised in homes where love meant silence, and longing was a sign of virtue. A queen's heartbreak became a nation's straitjacket. And so, we must ask, what happens when one woman's sorrow becomes a country's standard? Does grief purify power or poison it? Because in Queen Victoria's empire, to mourn was divine, and to smile was treason. He was just a servant. A man who opened doors, tended horses, fetched letters. But to Victoria, John Brown was something more. He spoke to her plainly, refused to bow, called her woman instead of your majesty. And somehow, she let him. The court was horrified. After Albert's death, she had become unreachable, drowned in sorrow. But John Brown pulled her back, not with ceremony, but with companionship. He brought her whiskey in the evenings, took her riding through Scottish rain, and whispered truths no prince would dare speak. She trusted him with her safety, with her sadness, perhaps even with her soul. Whispers began. Was he her lover, her second husband? They shared a bedroom hallway. They dined alone. She fell ill. It was his name she called first. Letters referred to him as the Queen's Highland servant, and sometimes as her only friend. After his death, she wept harder than she had for some of her children. She had a statue built in his honor, and they destroyed it. After her death, her son tore it down, burned the letters, struck John Brown's name from official records. He was a scandal the empire could not afford. A servant too close to the crown, an intimacy too honest for history. And then came another Abdul Karim, an Indian Muslim clerk, younger than the Queen by decades, chosen to serve, chosen again to be erased. He taught her Urdu, shared stories of his homeland. She gave him rooms beside her own, honors never granted. 2 princes. And the court panicked once more. A queen at the height of imperialism, placing a colonized man at the heart of her world. After her death, they ransacked his quarters, took every letter, every gift, banished him without ceremony. The Queen had called him son. The empire called him dangerous, but buried beneath ashes, some of their words survived. And they speak of something rare, a queen who found truth not among lords, but among the men she was never meant to love. So ask yourself, is power measured by those who serve you or those who see you? And what does it mean that the men who saw Queen Victoria were erased? They found her journal beside the bed. The hand that wrote it, once trained for courtly grace, had grown shaky, but still precise. It was the last thing she touched before death. And in those final pages, the queen of an empire did not write about battles or jubilees, not about palaces or parliaments. She wrote about love and sorrow and ghosts. There were names, some public, some never meant to be read again. Albert, John, Abdul, names written not with titles, but with trembling memory. She described dreams in which they returned, walked with her in gardens, laughed beneath gaslight, touched her hand without protocol. I am so tired of silence, she wrote. They speak to me more clearly than the living. And elsewhere, I was a woman before I was a queen, and I was a girl before I was even seen. She mourned her children, not just the ones lost, but the ones who never truly knew her. Wrote of longing for ordinary things, walking alone, sleeping late, being loved without duty. In the margins, she asked questions history never answered. Did they love me or the crown? Was I ever more than their symbol? The final sentence reads like a confession carved in grief. When they bury me, let them bury the truth beside me, for I have seen it and I have survived it, but I do not forgive it. No courtier was allowed to read it. Her family hid the volume, locked it away, and in its place, they published the version they preferred. The monarch, the widow, the saint, the real woman, the one who raged, wept, loved, envied, questioned. She was left in the shadows, but history has a way of bleeding through. Scraps surfaced, pages reappeared, enough to glimpse a sovereign whose greatest secret was not who she loved, but that she dared to feel anything at all. And so, in the end, what remains is not the throne, but the voice behind it, the girl who became a goddess, the goddess who became a ghost, the ghost who, in her own words, was never truly seen.